Good evening and welcome. Tonight, what you did not hear about during the testimony of former Special Counsel Robert Mueller before Congress. The facts of how the Russians targeted African American voters in an effort to keep them from going to the polls, a strategy that almost exactly paralleled that of the Trump campaign during the last election. Political pros call it voter suppression. So how was it that a group of Russians in an office building in St. Petersburg were able to precisely target the same voters that Republicans were targeting here? Just a coincidence?
The misinformation effort on the part of Russian trolls.
This morning we're learning Russian interference went beyond the election.
The Russians set up 30 Facebook pages targeting African Americans.
There's been all this talk from the Mueller report to the Senate and House investigatory committees about the fact of Russian interference
in the 2016 presidential election.
What there hasn't been is an examination on how they sought to interfere in our elections.
Mark Morial, a former mayor of New Orleans, now runs the National Urban League.
It appears as though a big part of their effort was designed to suppress African American voter turnout.
All she wants is power.
By, for example, creating trolls and memes and fake personalities who were associated and aligned with the Black Lives Matter movement, and use those, if you will, mouthpieces to suggest that African Americans should not vote.
This woman is a witch. You know, he's tried to pretend like an angel, but she's an evildoer.
They created, if you will, a meme, a social media meme, under the banner of African Americans for Hillary Clinton, as though it was coming from a group of African Americans who supported Hillary Clinton. Had her photo on it. What it said is, avoid the lines, vote from home, text to this number.
Of course, there was no way to vote from home or to vote via text.
Now, people would say, well, who would be so gullible? Consider an 18, 19, 21-year-old person who's grown up in the social media world, who all of a sudden sees something coming, quote unquote, from the campaign, suggesting that they could vote from home.
And it all came from Russia, from an operation called the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, with what U.S. officials say was surprising sophistication in its deception. According to the Pew Research Center, turnout among African American voters was down substantially in the 2016 election, from 66% of eligible voters to 60% of eligible voters, a decrease of 765,000 nationwide.
We had such a close election that if the Russians succeeded in simply fooling some of the people, some of the time, in only some of the states, they could have affected this election. I wonder who in the United States may have been cooperating with them, or assisting them, or aiding them, or abetting them. I can't answer that question.
One answer comes from what happened on the top floor of this building in New York City, at a private cigar club, where, according to the Mueller report, it was here that Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, quote, briefed Kalibnik, identified by the FBI as a Russian operative, on the state of the Trump campaign and Manafort's plan to win the election. That briefing encompassed the campaign's messaging and its internal polling data.
In the
Former Special Counsel Mueller confirmed all of that and more in his congressional testimony this week.
Months before that meeting, Manafort had caused internal data to be shared with Kalibnik, and the sharing continued for some period of time after their August meeting. Isn't that correct?
Accurate.
It also included a discussion of battleground states, which Manafort identified as Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota.
Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Who knows what was going on with the president, but at least at the Manafort level, I think there's very strong evidence, if not yet a smoking gun, that some kinds of coordination could have been taking place.
Congressman Jamie Raskin is a Democrat from Maryland who serves on the House Judiciary Committee. But does it make sense to you the people at the IRA, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia, would figure out to go after black votes in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania?
Well, we don't know whether or not it was just a coincidence. So we know from the Mueller report that there was a sweeping and systematic campaign by the Russians to undermine and subvert our presidential election in order to throw it to Donald Trump. And now we have reportage that the Russians were deliberately trying to suppress African American women from turning out in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, and other places. And it looks like that strategy was parallel to a Republican strategy.
And joining us now from Washington to talk about all this is Jill Wine-Banks, a former member of the Watergate Special Prosecutors Team and a former executive director of the American Bar Association. Thank you for being here. Let me ask you, Jill Wine-Banks, do you believe in coincidences?
I'm not a believer in coincidences or conspiracy theories. Of course, it's certainly obvious that the voters who needed to be suppressed were African American women, but it is not a coincidence that that's the exact information and polling data that Manafort turned over to the Russians, and probably for financial gain. He was using his knowledge to try to get out of some debts to oligarchs in Russia.
Well, do you think Robert Mueller did enough to investigate this aspect? It seems to have these parallel political campaigns, one from St. Petersburg, Russia, one from the Trump campaign.
I think he established the Russian hacking and the social media segment, but he did not follow the money, which, going back to Watergate, following the money is exactly the way to find things. And in this case, there's a lot of financial motives for the cooperation with Russia. Donald Trump wanted to make millions, hundreds of millions from the Trump power. And so he continued to do it. And the same thing is true for Manafort, who owed a great debt in Russia. And he used this power that he had and knowledge that he had to try to win over some of the oligarchs to relieve his debt.
Jill, we have a question for you from the control room from our executive producer, Rhonda Schwartz.
Jill, you're a former prosecutor. Why couldn't Mueller do more on this? Why was it beyond his purview? With all our intelligence agencies, couldn't they investigate further?
Appointment announcement. And that said that he was to investigate whether or not the Russians had hacked and interfered in our election in any way, and whether anyone on the Trump team was involved in that action, which is not the same thing as whether or not they had shared polling data, I guess. I think it's a logical extension, and that if I were making the decision as Robert Mueller as to whether or not I had jurisdiction, I would have erred on the side of inclusiveness, and I would have probably investigated further. Now, there is clearly future cases still pending. And so the question is whether this is one of the ones that he did not resolve, but he did not close, and that it's one of the ones he can't talk about because it's still pending.
So you think more might be coming very quickly, Jill?
I don't know if it'd be quick, but I think there's more coming for sure.
Jill Wine-Banks, thank you so much for being in our program tonight. Very much appreciated.